Hi, my research dragons. This is week 2 continued, and I'm going to talk about the 3 categories of research, which are qualitative, quantitative, and mixed measure. And I'm going to use my research as an example. Number 1, to show you how they can morph into each other, and number 2, in case any of you want to jump on board with that research. Okay. So, as I said before, there's more than 3 categories. There's a lot of categories. And I know that if you took me or Hurwitz or Dr. Law for your undergrad, then you know this, okay? You know that there's archival and historical, applied, pure, anthropological, legal, all kinds of different research. There's factorial designs and non-factorial designs and counterbalance designs and all of those different sorts of things. We are going to go over some of those in this class. Also, I don't know, some of you didn't go to Tiffin University, so I don't know what you guys did in your class. So I'm going to go over this with you. For some of you, it'll be like a review. For others of you, it'll be like a painful, horrible memory. You're going to have PTSD flashbacks to the time when, oh my God, Dr. Victor tried to kill me the first time around, and so did Dr. Hurwitz, and now they're trying to kill me again. And for others of you, somebody might actually be excited about research, as I am. So they're all interchangeable, and they all can teach you something about the different categories, and you should let the research pick the method that you want to use to conduct your research, because it makes it more creative and gives you more freedom, and who knows, you might find something really cool to do that way. So I'm going to tell you about my own research interests and how they morphed, and you can see how they fit into the different categories. So for my undergrad, I was a psych major, ethology major, and I was very interested in why people thought the things that they thought and how they thought. And so a lot of cognitive psych kinds of things. And I did have a professor who kept saying things to me like, criminal psychology, that's where it's at. And I was thinking, oh my God, that's the most boring stuff in the world. What is he talking about? Okay. So anyway, after that, I found myself at Harvard with Lawrence Kohlberg. I don't know if you know Lawrence Kohlberg. He's a rather famous psychologist, and I was lucky enough to be there at a time when I could actually talk to someone like B.F. Skinner and Lawrence Kohlberg, doing all kinds of cool research. But Larry, I called him Larry, did research on moral values, and he decided to do the development of moral values and how people made decisions based on morality. He was doing research that was very Piagetian. So he followed Piaget's model. And for those of you who know Piaget, he did like cognitive constancy and all of those kinds of things, development, how children come to develop constancy and things like that. The criticism of that is that it's very qualitative, it's very theoretical, and there's no quantification, there's no numbers to it. So it's all theory. How do you go about proving that? So Larry's research was the same sort of thing. And he did a famous model. He used a lot of moral dilemmas, and he wanted to see how people would solve them, and then he categorized them in terms of moral development. So it too was theoretical, but it was also qualitative. His famous one was the Heinz dilemma, which I'm going to put a thing up so that you can see what it is. And you'll see how qualitative it was. So I was very much into that. Carol Gillikin was there at the time. Like I said, Skinner and Larry as well. We're doing all this kinds of really cool research. And I'm starting to notice this guy who's doing research in Ohio. And he's doing research on, it's a weird type of psychology. It wasn't criminal psychology, because it didn't only talk about the criminal. It talked about the victims, but mostly he was talking about social cognition. How do people think about things? How do they go into a legal situation and make a verdict? How do they make a decision that someone is guilty or not guilty? How do they incorporate evidence? What do they do when that evidence becomes complex? And I'm, reading this stuff, and I'm thinking, reading this stuff and thinking, well, what about moral values? Don't jurors make decisions on moral values, not just evidence? So I literally had the nerve to call this man up. I still can't believe I did this. I called him up, and his name, he's a famous researcher in his own right. His name is Erwin Horowitz, not Hurwitz. Irv Horowitz. And I call him up, and he says, you can use the moral values perspective in jury decision making. Maybe they do make decisions on moral values. I haven't really considered that. Maybe you should come out and we can talk about it, and you can see what we have here in Ohio. And I'm just like, Ohio? I live in Massachusetts, the hub of the universe. That's not my opinion. That was a famous person said Boston was the hub of the universe. And he says, you should come to Toledo, Ohio. I don't even know where that is. It's very easy. You just get on the Massachusetts Turnpike, which is 90, and you just keep going. When it says Toledo, get off. Anyway, so I go to Toledo, and I sit down, and I go to his office at University of Toledo, and I walk in, and his walls are all chalkboard, and it's covered in equations. And I walk in, and I look at it, and I'm looking at what he's doing, and it has all evidence, and it has jury decision making, and it has the weight of the evidence in terms of what the jury used to reach a particular decision. And I look at him and I say, is that a path analysis? And he says, yes, it is a path analysis. And he said, the attorneys at the law school think I'm crazy, but what I did was I quantified these verdicts along social cognition lines so that they could see what type of evidence that jurors are using when they decide cases. And I was like, oh my God, that's really cool. And, I was kind of sold right there, right? So he says, you should come to Toledo and we can do research and it'll be really cool. And, it's just a different type of psychology. It's psychology and law. It's not just criminal behavior. It's the legal system, victims and court system and policy, social policy, discrimination, everything. So I go, okay, I'll leave Harvard and I will go to University of Toledo, which I did. And it was a great adventure. And he attracted forensic psychology students from all over the world. My research partners in Australia, that's where I met them. And this is at a time when the American Psychological Association didn't have a name for what he was studying. Today it's forensic psychology. It's Division 41 of the APA. But we're talking about the 80s. It wasn't even, a registered field of subdivision of the American Psychological Association. It is now. So there you go. We were on the bleeding edge, not the cutting edge. But what he found was a way to take one discipline and translate it into a scientific discipline. It was like the law and science were talking two different languages, and he found the key to translating it to a genuine empirical study, and that is forensic psychology. So it was amazing, and it was an amazing time to be there, and I really got into it, of course. So then he was interested in toxic torts. Toxic tort is like when you pollute the environment, and then the lawsuits that follow, they're civil suits. And he was interested to see what jurors do in those kinds of situations, how they make decisions in those kinds of situations. And it's very interesting to see, because there's a lot of different questions that surround that sort of thing. So you're never at a loss in terms of what kind of questions can I ask. Do they have to be, I have qualitative questions, but I want to find a way to measure it. And I want to find a way to get attorneys to understand this. Attorneys are notoriously reluctant to do research, statistics, and things like that. They just figure that it's too difficult, which it really isn't. And it could really help their case a lot. That's what you do as trial consultants, is you do research and use it in the trial. So it's very cool, and this is what we started to do. And we started to do toxic tort cases. We started to do toxic tort cases all over the place, and looking at questions such as, how do people understand this? Do you have to be very well educated to make a better verdict? What kind of evidence do you use? Do you use probative evidence, non-probative evidence? Do you use things that have nothing to do with the evidence? Is there a difference between males and females, or is there a difference between geographic parts of the country, between racial and ethnic groups, between men and women, between criminal and civil cases? What happens when the evidence becomes really complex? Do people just space out and then don't use that kind of information? What happens if the juror is older versus a younger juror? What happens if you separate them by political party, or different countries? Do different countries have different standards for understanding civil cases? Because pollution just doesn't stay in the one place where you do that. So you have civil cases that can go on between countries as well. How do they come to understand these things? Are there any biases? Do people understand statistics? How do they make decisions? What kind of cognitive mechanisms drive those decisions? How do they think about them? How do they discern things like what's right and what's wrong, what's just and what's not just, what's fair under the law? How do they determine punishment? How much punishment should someone get for what they've done? What about compensatory and punitive damages awards? How do they determine that? So those are things that happen in the real world. Those are social cognition. They look at things that are happening in society and the way that people think in a legalistic framework. So you're bridging a lot of different disciplines here: science, statistics, psychology, and the law, right? It's bringing all those things together. So I developed a love for toxic torts, and especially during climate change, it's very interesting to me. Like, how do people come to know this? How do they place blame? Who's to blame for climate change? Who should pay to clean up the environment and to reverse climate change, if it is even reversible? So it's a person's struggle to do the cause of justice. And there's psychological components. So these are all psychological, all psychological questions. We have other psychological questions as well in the law, like, do people have a basic knowledge of the law? Remember I told you in the last video that people think you're either guilty or innocent? There's no such thing as innocent. Can people apply the law? We used to do studies with, do kids understand their Miranda rights? And they don't. People don't understand their Miranda rights, and they give them up all the time. What happens when people get into a group in a jury? So you may feel one thing on your own, and then you're sitting in the group and everybody else feels the other way. Do you change your decision and you go along with the group even though you disagree? We know from social psychology, the ASH study, that that's exactly what happens. So does it happen in a jury as well? Can one person sway the other 11 on the jury? The 12 Angry Men case? Usually the 11 persuade the holdout, but it's very difficult to do what was done in that movie. So that movie was really not correct, okay? So all of these things are very interesting. They're very complex. You're asking what happens when you get an individual in this kind of situation. How does that affect the data? And really, you're using a lot of different types of cases, a lot of different types of research models, and they're all melding together: qualitative, quantitative, and mixed measures designs. So that's that for that. I'm going to make another video about the research I'm doing now to see if any of you want to jump on board and how that all developed. See you in the next video.